What happens when the economic system that an entire society depends on stops working? Not for a season, but for a decade. In October 1929, the United States stock market collapsed in a matter of days, triggering a cascade of bank failures, business closures, and unemployment that within 3 years had left a quarter of the American workforce without jobs and reshaped the relationship between governments and economies for the rest of the 20th century. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
The Great Depression is often told as a story about a market crash, but the crash was a trigger, not a cause. The causes were structural, accumulated over years, and the failure to see them was itself part of the story. Tonight, we turn to the most severe economic crisis in modern American history, and to the question of how a society builds trust in the systems that have failed it. The question is not only what caused the Great Depression, but what it revealed about the assumptions embedded in the economic systems of the early 20th century, and why those revelations still shape the way modern governments manage economic crisis.
The Great Depression did not begin on a single day in October 1929. It was the visible surface of a set of structural problems that had been building through the 1920s. Excessive speculative investment, an agricultural sector already in crisis for most of the decade, deep inequality in wealth distribution, a banking system with inadequate reserves and no federal insurance, and an international monetary system under significant strain.
We are speaking about the Great Depression, the economic collapse that began in the United States in 1929 and spread across the global economy, reshaping financial systems, government policy, and the lives of tens of millions of people.
Its consequences extended far beyond the economic. The Depression altered the political landscape of the United States and contributed to conditions of instability elsewhere in the world that shaped the path to the Second World War. Understanding it requires seeing both the human experience and the structural mechanisms that produced it.
Then let us begin with the 1920s, the decade that made the crash possible.
The 1920s in the United States were a period of genuine economic expansion and also of significant financial excess. Industrial production grew. Consumer goods became more widely available, and the stock market rose dramatically. Between 1925 and 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average approximately tripled. Many Americans who had never before owned stocks began investing, often on margin, meaning they borrowed money to buy shares, betting that rising prices would allow them to repay the loans and retain a profit. The agricultural sector had not shared in this prosperity. Farmers had overproduced during the First World War to meet European demand, gone into debt to expand production, and then faced falling prices through the 1920s as European agriculture recovered. Rural banks, heavily exposed to farm debt, had been failing throughout the decade. The Depression, when it came, fell on an agricultural economy that was already in serious distress.
So the 1920s prosperity was real for some sectors and illusory for others.
Yes, and here is the first thing we need to correct about the standard account. In reality, the American economy was already slowing before the crash, and the crash itself, though severe, need not have produced a depression of the scale that followed. The policy decisions made in the months and years after the crash transformed a severe recession into the worst economic catastrophe of the modern era. On October 24, 1929, Black Thursday, panic selling began on the New York Stock Exchange. By October 29, Black Tuesday, the market had lost approximately 30% of its value from its September peak. Investors who had bought on margin faced margin calls they could not meet. Forced selling drove prices lower, which triggered more margin calls, which drove prices lower still. The downward spiral was self-reinforcing.
So the structure of margin investing amplified the crash rather than simply reflecting it.
Yes, and the banking system transmitted the crisis from the stock market to the broader economy. Depositors, fearing for their savings, began withdrawing money from banks. As deposits fell, banks called in loans and reduced lending. As lending fell, businesses could not meet payroll or fund operations. Failures spread from financial firms to manufacturers to retailers. Between 1929 and 1933, approximately 9,000 banks in the United States closed their doors. There was no federal deposit insurance. When a bank failed, the deposits simply disappeared. Families and businesses that had placed their savings in those institutions lost everything. The psychological effect was as significant as the financial one. Trust in the banking system collapsed, and people who still had money held it rather than depositing it or spending it.
So rational individual behavior, holding on to cash, made the collective problem worse.
Precisely. This dynamic, where individually rational responses to crisis collectively deepen it, is one of the defining features of economic depressions. It is also one of the reasons that the standard economic wisdom of the era, that governments should balance their budgets and allow the market to correct itself, was so disastrously inadequate as a policy response. When private spending collapses, government spending contraction makes the collapse worse, not better. By 1933, unemployment in the United States had reached approximately 25%. Industrial production had fallen by nearly half from its 1929 peak. Thousands of breadlines and soup kitchens operated in cities across the country. Makeshift settlements of unemployed people, constructed from whatever materials could be found, appeared on the edges of cities. They were called Hoovervilles, after the president who was widely blamed for the failure to respond adequately to the crisis.
So, the crisis had a name attached to it before it had a solution.
Yes, Herbert Hoover was not an incompetent or indifferent president. He was a genuinely capable administrator who had overseen extraordinary humanitarian relief operations in Europe after the First World War. But his economic philosophy held that voluntary cooperation between business leaders combined with some targeted federal support was preferable to large-scale government intervention. In the context of a systemic collapse of this magnitude, that philosophy was insufficient. His reluctance to act more forcefully defined his presidency and ended it. The environmental catastrophe of the Dust Bowl compounded the economic crisis across the Great Plains. Decades of deep plowing had removed the native grasses that held the topsoil in place. When severe drought struck through the 1930s, the soil simply blew away in massive dust storms that darkened the sky across multiple states. Hundreds of thousands of farming families lost their land and their livelihoods and migrated west, primarily to California, where they faced poverty, discrimination, and desperate competition for scarce work.
So the Depression was both an economic and an environmental disaster, and the two reinforced each other.
Yes, Franklin Roosevelt was elected in November 1932 by a wide margin, carrying 32 of the 48 states. He was inaugurated in March 1933 with the banking system in acute crisis. Several states had already declared bank holidays to prevent further runs. In his inaugural address he stated that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, a formulation that recognized the self-reinforcing psychological dimension of the crisis as clearly as any economic analysis. The New Deal that followed was not a single coherent program, but a series of experiments, some successful, some not, driven by the pragmatic conviction that the federal government had to act on a scale commensurate with the scale of the crisis. The first 100 days of Roosevelt's presidency produced an extraordinary volume of legislation. The Emergency Banking Act stabilized the banking system. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial and investment banking. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation protected individual deposits. The Agricultural Adjustments Act attempted to raise farm prices by managing supply.
So the New Deal was a restructuring of the relationship between the federal government and the economy, not just a relief program.
Precisely. The Works Progress Administration put millions of unemployed Americans to work building roads, bridges, schools, post offices, and public buildings. The Social Security Act of 1935 created a federal system of retirement insurance for the first time. The National Labor Relations Act strengthened the rights of workers to organize and bargain collectively. These were not temporary emergency measures. They were structural changes in how American society organized the relationship between work, capital, and the state. The debate about whether the New Deal actually ended the Depression remains active among economic historians. Unemployment fell from 25% in 1933 to around 14% by 1937. But a premature attempt to balance the federal budget in 1937 caused a sharp recession that pushed unemployment back toward 19%. Full recovery came only with the mobilization for the Second World War, which produced the scale of government spending that the New Deal had approached but never fully reached. The role of the Federal Reserve in the early years of the Depression is one of the most studied and most debated questions in economic history. The Federal Reserve, created in 1913 to serve as a lender of last resort and to stabilize the banking system, responded to the crash by raising interest rates in 1931 in an attempt to defend the gold standard and prevent capital flight. This decision, made at precisely the moment when the economy needed cheap credit, is now widely regarded by economists as a catastrophic policy error that deepened and prolonged the Depression.
So the institution designed to prevent banking crises made the banking crisis significantly worse.
Yes, Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, in their landmark 1963 study, A Monetary History of the United States, argued that the Federal Reserve's failure to prevent the collapse of the money supply was the primary cause of the Depression's severity. Ben Bernanke, who later became chairman of the Federal Reserve, accepted this analysis and in 2002 stated explicitly that the Fed would not repeat the same mistake. When the financial crisis of 2008 arrived, the Fed responded with massive liquidity injections, essentially enacting the lesson that the Depression had taught. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 is another policy decision that historians identify as having worsened the Depression. The act raised import duties on hundreds of goods to historically high levels. The stated goal was to protect American industry and agriculture. The actual effect was to provoke retaliatory tariffs from trading partners, dramatically reducing international trade and further contracting the global economy. World trade fell by approximately 65% between 1929 and 1932, and the Smoot-Hawley tariff contributed to that collapse.
So a policy designed to protect the American economy from foreign competition helped destroy the global trade that American producers depended on.
Yes, and this pattern, where individually rational-seeming protective measures collectively produce a worse outcome for everyone, is one of the defining dynamics of global economic crises. The international response to Smoot-Hawley, which was to raise tariffs in turn, made every economy worse off than if no one had moved first. It is a classic example of what economists call a coordination failure, where the outcome that is best for everyone requires cooperation that no individual actor has an incentive to initiate. The human geography of the Depression was marked by large-scale internal migration. The Dust Bowl migrants, predominantly from Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and surrounding states, became one of the iconic groups of the time. Their journey west and their reception in California, where they were often met with hostility and exploitative labor conditions, was documented by John Steinbeck in The Grapes of Wrath, published in 1939, which brought the human cost of the agricultural crisis to a national readership, and won the Pulitzer Prize.
So the literature of the Depression became part of how Americans understood what had happened to them.
Yes, and this cultural dimension of the Depression is as significant as its economic one. The photographs of Dorothea Lange, the music of Woody Guthrie, the fiction of Steinbeck, and the radio broadcasts of Roosevelt's fireside chats all contributed to a shared national experience of the crisis that created a collective memory which shaped American political culture for a generation. The Depression was not only an economic event, it was a formative national experience that changed how Americans thought about government, solidarity, and the obligations of a society to its members.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to understand the Great Depression from the inside, from the perspective of someone living through it in real time, where would you invite them to continue it?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with the Great Depression, a diary by Benjamin Roth.
So this is a first-hand account written in real time, not a retrospective reconstruction.
Roth was a young lawyer in Youngstown, Ohio, who kept a diary through the Depression years. He writes with the uncertainty of someone who does not know how the story ends, observing bank failures, business closures, and the daily erosion of confidence with the immediacy of lived experience. The book captures the fear, the confusion, and the occasional small recoveries that gave and then withdrew hope, in a way that no historical analysis written afterward quite manages to reproduce.
Is it accessible to readers without a background in economics or American history?
The diary format makes it immediately accessible. Roth writes as an observer, not as an analyst. The economic events he describes are always filtered through the experience of someone trying to understand what is happening to his community and to his own livelihood. A reader who knows nothing about the Depression will understand what it felt like from the inside by the time they finish the book.
So it gives the reader the texture of the crisis that aggregate statistics cannot convey.
Precisely. Roth was a careful observer who also read the economic literature of his time, which means the diary is both a personal document and a record of how an intelligent layperson tried to make sense of an event that was exceeding the explanatory frameworks available to him.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The immediate institutional legacy of the Great Depression was a fundamental transformation of the American federal government's role in economic life. Before the Depression, the federal government was a relatively limited presence in the economy. After it, the mechanisms of the New Deal created a permanent infrastructure of social insurance, financial regulation, and economic management that defined American governance for the rest of the 20th century. The intellectual legacy was equally significant. The economist John Maynard Keynes published The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money in 1936, providing the theoretical framework for understanding why market economies could become trapped in prolonged downturns, and why government spending could in principle break that trap. The Keynesian revolution in economic thought, which dominated policy in the decades after the Second World War, was directly shaped by the experience of the Depression and the apparent success of government intervention in managing it.
So the Depression produced not only policy changes, but a new economic theory to explain and justify them.
Yes, and this theoretical shift had consequences far beyond the United States. The post-war international economic order, including the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates and the creation of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, was designed explicitly to prevent a repetition of the conditions that had produced and prolonged the Depression. The architects of that order, including Keynes himself, were building a system around the lessons of the 1930s. The global dimension of the Depression is often underemphasized in American accounts. Germany, already burdened by war reparations and political instability, was devastated by the withdrawal of American loans following the crash. Unemployment in Germany reached over 30% by 1932. The economic collapse created the conditions in which a political movement promising national revival and the restoration of dignity could attract mass support. The Depression did not cause the Second World War, but it created the economic and political soil in which the forces that led to it could grow.
So the economic collapse in New York in 1929 had consequences that reached Berlin, Tokyo, and London within a few years.
Yes, and this global transmission of the crisis through trade networks, financial linkages, and the international gold standard is one of the features that distinguishes the Great Depression from ordinary recessions. Modern economies are even more tightly interconnected than those of the 1930s, which is why the financial crisis of 2008, though ultimately less severe, produced such immediate global policy coordination. The lesson of the Depression, that financial crises crossed borders without asking permission, had been absorbed. The modern relevance of the Great Depression is perhaps clearest in the debates it continues to generate about the proper role of government in economic life. Every major financial crisis since 1933 has been interpreted partly through the lens of the Depression, whether the government response is adequate, whether bank failures should be allowed or prevented, whether austerity or stimulus is the appropriate medicine. The Depression set the terms of those debates and has never fully released them.
So we are still arguing in every economic crisis about what the Depression taught us.
Yes, and the fact that the argument continues reflects something important. The Depression did not produce a settled consensus about what caused it or what fixed it. Different economic schools draw different lessons. What it did produce, beyond doubt, is a set of institutional structures: deposit insurance, central bank lender of last resort functions, social safety nets, financial regulation that have moderated the severity of every subsequent crisis. Whether those structures are sufficient or whether they create their own risks remains an open question that each generation must answer for itself.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the speculative decade that preceded the crash, the wave of bank failures that followed it, the human cost of the Depression, and the lasting institutional and intellectual changes it produced.
The Great Depression reminds us that economic systems are not natural forces. They are human constructions. And when they fail, the question of who bears the cost and who has the power to rebuild them is always a political question as much as an economic one.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.